Hey everyone, I just did a significant upgrade to my Axial Capra. I have super low speed control with a Hobbywing Fusion Pro motor. I have improved ground clearance with the Vader skid plate system. I can control normal steering, proportional rear steer. I can use a switch to switch into opposite steer, or I can use that same switch to put me into crab walk mode. And all of this with a programmable long-range radio. Want to see how I did it? Stay tuned. Hi everyone, today's video is about upgrading the Axial Capra with the Hobbywing Quick Run Fusion Pro brushless motor. I really enjoyed having this motor in my TRX4, and now that I've gotten into the Capra, I've only made really just tires and wheels changes, so I'm really looking to upgrade some of the electronics, and a great place to start is a brushless motor. In the Capra, if you're going to do a brushless motor, you have to upgrade the receiver, change the receiver, and you also have to do a skid plate. And we'll talk about why in a minute. While we're making those changes, updating the receiver, I'm going to update my transmitter. I'm going to a RadioMaster MT12 transmitter. And while we're in there, we're going to change the pinion on the motor to improve our gear reduction a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about why we need to make some of these changes at the same time. So I put together a whiteboard here so we can talk to it, and if you want, you can pause and look at these diagrams a little bit. So some of the goals for what we're doing: we want better speed control, and that's largely delivered by the brushless motor. The Quick Run Fusion Pro has all kinds of programmable settings. You can change the brake, you can change the way it responds to the throttle. You can really tune that thing to your style of driving. We want to get better servo control. So in going to a different receiver with a much more programmable transmitter, we'll be able to control the servos a lot better. In particular, we'll be able to do things like four-wheel steer and crab walking much better than the standard transmitter. We will also get slightly more ground clearance out of the Vader skid plate. So why do you have to do all these things at once? So let's take a look at what the stock setup is. So the stock setup has a transmitter that talks to a combination receiver ESC, and then that ESC governs a motor and your servos. The Hobbywing Fusion Pro is a combination motor ESC. So you're going to have this ESC. You can't have two ESCs in the system. So this block kind of clunks over there, so you need to do a new receiver. Also, because of the size of the Quick Run Fusion Pro, it's a little bit longer than the stock motor because it has the ESC on the end, so it doesn't fit with the current skid plate. So we will use a kit from Vader. The Vader skid plate gives us a little bit more room to fit that bigger motor ESC combo in it. And then for the transmitter that I've chosen the RadioMaster MT12. The MT12 is the first ELRS supported surface radio. This is you can do some research into what ELRS is. It's basically an open source operating system for radios. It was very popular among radio controlled airplanes and drones enthusiasts. And this is the first surface radio that is fully supported by that open source community. So there's all kinds of neat things you can do programmable buttons and switches and all kinds of programmable potentiometers. I'll probably do a specific video on that, but for this video, we will be mostly focusing on what it takes to install this new hardware. And in order to do that successfully, we're going to go through a couple steps. Research and buy, you can tell I've already done that. Hopefully this video acts as some research for you. We're going to disassemble and document. This is really important. This document part, the simplest way to do that is as you're taking your truck apart, take some pictures. Because the worst thing that can happen is you end up with a pile of bolts and you don't know where anything goes, or you don't know where cables ran. So take some pictures. Then we're going to install the new stuff, and then we're going to stand it up. All right, stay tuned. Let's upgrade our truck. Okay, first step to work on this guy, we've got to take off the upper tube frame, and that means getting at these 4 bolts right here and on the other side, and then also removing these shocks here and here. And that'll start to let us see what's going on inside where the motor and transmission are underneath here. So let's take all that stuff off and see what's in there. Okay, so now we're in. Couple things to comment on there. So you might have seen during the disassembly, I lowered this stand. I've always thought, like, why would anyone want that anywhere but all the way up so that you can have big trucks, little trucks? Well, this is why. So now that we've disconnected those suspension shocks, the axles want to droop down. And this is the way we're probably going to be doing a lot of work on this truck. So I lowered that down. A couple things you're going to see here. So this is the transmission. Maybe I'll pick up the camera. This is the transmission that transmits torque out to these drive shafts, both front and rear. The motor is mounted onto the transmission. The transmission is bolted onto the skid plate. So we're going to have to remove this whole skid plate assembly and reconnect the transmission onto the new one. You can see there's also a bunch of cabling that runs from servos, motor, to the receiver, which is mounted right here. Another interesting thing you'll see on the receiver, this capacitor here, sometimes this is called a glitch buster. This is a tuning capacitor that helps to smooth out the voltage. I think it manages some high frequency spikes that can pop up on the common voltage on your receiver. So I don't think our new receiver is going to need that. When you're dealing with a capacitor, this one's kind of big. Just be careful not to cross the terminals. It shouldn't have any charge in it. This truck hasn't been plugged in a long time, but certainly when you're doing this, you just want to be careful with the capacitor. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start disassembling all of this cabling. Well, yeah, maybe I can keep some of this cabling in place. I'm going to figure out what cabling I should take out, and I'm going to disassemble this receiver from the body and start getting some of that stuff out of the way. And then once we have the motor disconnected especially, then we'll start working on disassembling the transmission from the skid plate. Okay, so we've disconnected a bunch of wires, and now we have the body free from the skid plate suspension links and axles. So now it's time to remove this old receiver, and I guess I was hoping there would be bolts, you know, to indicate that this thing was secured, but it looks like it's just a piece of two-sided tape. So just kind of this sticky two-sided tape. So I guess that's how we're going to remount the new receiver in future. So let's just kind of carefully pull this guy off without trying to break anything. Yeah, that's fine. So let's push this guy off. Yeah. Okay, there she comes. So this is the old receiver, and it is now free. I don't know, maybe keep it for some other project that you're going to do. Things you'll see on the receiver. So this is where the receiver ESC gets power from the battery. This is where the power gets distributed out to the motor. And then all of these channels are where your various servos will connect. This will be a little bit different for our new configuration. You can see this new receiver is much, much smaller, much lighter. And that's because it doesn't have to have all the power distribution electronics in it for the ESC. All of that instead is on the motor ESC combo. So when you look at the motor ESC combo, this is where you'll see this big heavy connector that goes to your battery. And in the case of the Capra, it is the same connector as came stock, different color for some reason. And then this has a servo, or a receiver connector that will share voltage out from the battery through the ESC, and that voltage will go to power servos through your receiver. So okay, so we've got that body off. Now we could mount the receiver. Maybe we'll wait to mount the receiver until we see where all the cables end up. So we're going to set all this stuff aside, and now we're going to remove the transmission from the skid plate. Then we're going to remove the motor from the transmission, and then we're going to take apart all the skid plate components and build up the new Vader skid plate. So interjecting here, the Hobbywing Fusion Pro comes with an XT60 connector for the battery, and my Spectrum smart batteries come with an IC3 connector. So you can get a variety of adapters you can find on Amazon or any of the hobby stores. You can find an adapter that goes from one type to the other. You can get this flexible one, or I've been using this rigid one just because it's smaller and fits in this space. So that works well, and you can also find them to adapt to the Traxxas battery system. So you can use whatever batteries you have with this. These adapters are great. Okay, so now it's time to remove the transmission from the skid plate and the skid plate assembly from the whole suspension assembly. I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the suspension links off. So there are bolts here and here, and then there's also, spin this all around, you can access some bolts on the underside right here that hold these lower links in. And then you can see there are a number of bolts here that hold the suspension in place. So I'm going to take the links off first, then we'll get at hold the transmission in place. So we'll take the links off first, then we'll take the transmission off, and then we'll have the skid plate assembly next to us as we build up all the pieces in the Vader skid plate. So there we go. We got the skid plate, transmission, and motor assembly free, and it was relatively easy. A couple of things to comment on there were when you're removing these little like long threaded rods, it is a, it's a smaller hex. It's a 1.5 millimeter, whereas most of the other stuff is 2 millimeter. And let's see if this will go in focus here. You have to get the hex in the top, and it's a little tricky to pull it out. So this is a place where having the non-ball head, let's see if I can get this focused here. No. Having the non-ball head Allen keys is really useful. So I have these tinitride coated straight Allen keys, and what that allows you to do is you can get in there and you can just apply a little bit of torque to it, and that allows you to pull it out. So I'd say be careful not to mar those up, and if you do, you may want to order replacements before putting them back in and then never being able to get them out again. All right, otherwise it was pretty straightforward. So now let's remove these bolts and get the transmission free. Okay, so we've removed the transmission and motor from the skid plate. This is a good time to stop and think about which end is forward. We've been spinning this guy around as we're doing this. I think I'm going to take a moment and label a thing or two. So the transmission points towards the front of the truck, whereas the motor leads point towards the back. So before I get anything mixed up, I'm gonna put a piece of tape on the front of the truck, and that'll just help us to keep track of it. I'm not sure whether it really matters or not. I don't know if these might just be symmetric. This looks like they're pretty symmetric. Anyway, nice to label it. All right, next step is going to be opening up the transmission case and getting at the mounting of the motor. and then we'll put the transmission, everything back together before we assemble the new skid plate assembly. Okay, so we've got all of the bolts out of this transmission housing cover. We're going to take these pieces off. One thing I like to do is I like to use a little organizer and keep bolts with their parts if possible. Taking this off, there are 4 short bolts. Let me get 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1 long bolt. And those are 4 here and 1 long there. So we're gonna keep those together and try to put them back the way we found them. All right, so now we're inside and we can see the spur gear that we're gonna replace as we swap the motor. So let's take these guys apart and we will put the new motor on. Okay, so we've taken the motor off of the transmission housing, and there's a couple things to observe here. One is that when the motor is in position, let's see, like this, you can see where those 2 bolt holes are that we just took the bolts out of, and you can slide the motor relative to the housing. So this is how you account for different size pinions. The pinion we're about to install, the stock is, I believe, a 14-tooth pinion. The pinion we're about to install is an 11-tooth pinion. So you can see it's a little bit smaller. This is a 32 pitch gear. So mine I got from Robinson Racing. You can see it's hardened and 32 pitch. So there's a bunch of different pitches, and if you get the pitch wrong, then the teeth don't mesh with each other properly. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this stock motor and say thanks for your service, put them aside, and then we're gonna take the new motor, mount the pinion, and then mount it into this housing. So I guess while we're here, we can start doing that right now. So you'll need a smaller Allen key. I think it's a 1.5. And we're gonna take out this little tiny set screw. And then, not a bad idea to get some blue thread locker and put a little bit on that set screw. I usually do this. There have been times when I just haven't done it and it's never really been a problem, but this stuff, I don't know, I don't think it can hurt. And if it stops a pinion from backing out and having to take all this stuff apart again, that would be pretty nice. So put a little of the blue stuff on there, get this started. And then what we're gonna look for is there's a flat spot on the shaft. We're gonna line up that flat spot with the set screw, and there'll probably be a little bit of adjustment once we get it in there. Let's get her in place. I guess at this point you can think about maybe which way you want your cables to point relative to the housing. Need a little more light so you guys can see what I'm doing. And you're gonna look down those slots until you can see the bolt holes in there. Hold on, let me turn on some more lights so you can see this. Okay, so we've got our pinion on our motor with thread locker in place. We're gonna move a little bit fast so that we don't let that thread locker completely dry on us. We're gonna start getting holes lined up, and we're gonna put these motor bolts back on. I can do this one-handed. Nice. Okay, so we're gonna put this bolt back in here, try and line it up with a hole on the motor. I guess at this point I should be thinking, where do I want these cables pointing? I think maybe I want the cables pointing something like that, because everything pretty much goes up into the body. Zoom out here. So I'm going to have my cables pointing up, vertical from the housing, and we'll see how that works out. All right, put this guy here. And we're not going to tighten it all the way. We're going to get these bolts started, and then we're going to slide this thing around until we get the gear mesh the way we want it. Feel around until we get, there we go. All right, so now they're both started. And what you, oh, they're not started. Yeah, okay. Nope. So this is a little bit of a trick. Look down in there, make sure we see a hole. Try and hold it still. And then push that bolt in. Feel if we've caught threads. Yes, okay, this time we did catch threads. All right, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna slide the motor until it's looking like it's meshed. Okay, so it's looking like it's meshed in this direction. Clearly got the distance wrong there. So now what we need to do, I'm gonna turn so I can see down this little slot. I'm obviously not the first guy to make that mistake. There's a little slot here where I can loosen up my set screw and pull it back out so that I get full mesh between those gears. And then we're going to tighten the set screw again. All right. Feels pretty good. Now, when you're setting the distance for this gear mesh, you don't want it rammed so tight together that it resists turning. I don't know, it feels like where I have it right now, it's pretty much as far as these bolts will let me go. And that feels all right, actually. So I'm going to tighten that down. Okay. All right, and another thing I'm going to do while I'm in here is I'm going to oil these gears. This guy was pretty loud when I got it stock, so I'm just going to use some synthetic lubricant and get a little on some of these gears. And we'll see if that shares around nicely. All right, we'll see if that doesn't quiet it down a little bit. Maybe we'll lubricate a few more things as we put it back together. Okay, so I think we have our motor mounted onto our transmission. Now we're going to put the transmission covers back on. Okay, so we have our Vader skid plate hardware here, and this is the stock injection molded skid plate. A couple things you'll notice is rather than being one piece, the Vader is a number of pieces. It's got a flat skid plate, and if you compare it to the existing, you're going to get substantial ground clearance improvement here. And then rather than having these arms that you attach the suspension to, you have these metal plates. There's a picture that comes with the skid plate, and this gives you clues on how things get assembled relative to each other. What you'll see here, we can look at this picture and we can see these three bolts or bolt holes waiting to attach the transmission. Those are these three guys here. And you can see that on this side, it's asking us to have this little extra nub sticking up that's going to be an attachment point for some of this structure that we mount the servo to. All right, let's put this guy together. Okay, so the instructions for the Vader skid plate are okay. There's a nice picture here, and if you understand what you're going to do, then you'll be able to confirm that you have done something right, but it doesn't really give you the full story. So I'm going to try and do that right now. So what I've done is I've built one half of the Vader skid plate, and I'll explain why in a minute. And it's the half that's pointing towards you in this instruction. So what you can see is there's a couple bolt holes here. Those bolt holes will serve to receive the transmission later. So see these bolt holes that we undid before, that's where you're going to bolt in your transmission. So what we've done here is we've built on one of the brackets that you're going to attach your suspension links to, and we've attached it with just this one countersunk fastener here, and we will later do something similar on the other side. But before we go on to that, we're going to talk about, this is the servo mount for a dig servo. So when you do a dig servo, I'll put this guy back on here. That is going to grab onto this guy and actuate this guy. So that's where your servo is going to go. So a couple tricks. One is when you are installing this 3D printed part, it's going to straddle this little nub that sticks up on only one of these brackets. The other bracket does not have a nub there, so make sure you get that right. And then you're gonna you're going to have 3 cap head screws and 1 countersunk screw that has it's sunk to clear the servo. And then this side is not actually going to be bolted on until you clamp it when you're installing one of your one of your suspension links. And then the other trick here is, much like how we undid these sunken threaded rods to grab onto these lower middle suspension links, we're going to have to do that through these holes on the Vader skid. But the trick is you've got to do that before you put this plate on, because there are no clearance holes to get in there and access that. So that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to install these suspension links, keeping track of which way is forward, although I don't know that it really matters. I was just looking at this again. I think it's pretty symmetric. And then once we get these middle lower links on, then we can attach these metal brackets. We can do the upper links, and then after we install the transmission and motor, these holes in the side of the body will eventually mate up with these holes in the Vader skid, and that'll clamp everything together. So this is a bit of a sandwich that you have to kind of hold together as you're bolting it all up, but once it's all together, it should be strong. All right, let's do that. Okay, so that was a little bit tricky. It's a little tough to get these links lined up and get both of them in there. You probably saw me wrestling with this one. And then on this guy, it was much easier. I stacked them together and tried to hold everything in place as I then drove the threaded rod through. So the next step here is we're going to, well, first let's make sure we get all of our links where they're supposed to be, and drive shafts on the right side. Okay, so we don't trap anything. Then the next thing we're gonna do is I've started this this countersunk bolt, and we're going to now install this countersunk bolt to hold this bracket on. And you can see when we do that, we're gonna be trapping those threaded rods that we just installed. And that's okay. That's just the way this thing is designed. So let's do that. Lined up, okay. And now what's gonna happen, this is going to hold this bracket, and next step here, we're going to install the second set of suspension links to probably, I think it's the middle hole is where they were before. Of course, there's a little bit of adjustability if you want to tune this, but we're going to use the middle hole here. I don't know, maybe this second from the top hole here, and install those links. And then to finally close these holes, the holes in the body will host the bolts, the stock bolts, that will finish attaching these brackets and give this whole assembly its full strength. So let's do that. Okay, at the end of that segment, you might have seen me struggling to try and get a nut onto this guy. I think this is about an it's an M3 by I think 14 millimeters. And that's long enough if there's no 3D printed part here. So in these 3 positions, it'll be enough. But when there is a 3D printed part here, and we try and stick this through, it does not protrude enough to get a nut on. So these guys at Vader are not exactly covering themselves with glory, especially with their attention to detail. So I just dug up an M3 by 20 with this little countersink. So I keep a lot of this stuff around. You can find on Amazon kits of bolts. So I just have thousands of these things around. They're pretty cheap. If you're gonna do this, you might consider buying a set of bolts, but this is an M3 by 20 millimeter. And if we use that, then what you'll see is it is long enough, and you can, in fact, get this nut on here. And where's my... So you can secure this thing. So, all right, so that's just a little hiccup. Maybe I'll include a link to that set. And then we'll do this last guy. And that will use the stock hardware. Oops, so we'll go like this. You can see I'm using the second from the bottom. I know I might have said something a little different earlier, but you can experiment with this. I'm not exactly sure if I want it higher or lower. We'll mess around and try and figure it out. Okay, let's tighten that up. Okay, all right, and with that, we've got our whole suspension put back together. You can see it's a little bit floppy, but next step is going to be reinstalling the transmission, and then we're going to start working on the radio gear. All right, so the next step is installing our transmission and motor onto the skid plate. But before we do that, I wanted to take an opportunity to look at why we had to replace the stock skid plate in the first place. So if we try and install the transmission with the Hobbywing Fusion Pro, you'll see that we run into this piece here. So one of the ways people handle this is by taking a Dremel and hacking away at this thing. That probably works, but figured we'd take the opportunity to get better ground clearance and swap in this Vader skid plate, see what it's all about. So, all right, so the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna put this transmission and motor in its position on the Vader. And you can see that the architecture of the Vader is such, let me turn it around here a little bit, is such that there's only one arm, and that one arm does not interfere with the motor. So this allows you to have this bigger Hobbywing Fusion Pro on here. All right, so next step, I'm going to tighten this up, and then we'll move on to probably electronics. Okay, so transmission and motor are installed. Next step, we're going to make sure that we have our drive shafts hooked up, and then we're going to probably get the truck back propped up on this guy so that they don't fall out. So, okay, so we'll make sure these little splines are here and lined up. Looks pretty good. And I think this one, get these lined up, because there will come a point when we drop this down lower and we hook up all the shocks and everything, and we reinstall the frame. And then if your drive shafts aren't hooked up at that point, it might be tricky to get them back in. All right, now what we're gonna do is we're going to install our receiver into its position in the frame of the truck. Let me hold a couple things here. So you may recall that the receiver was previously mounted right here. So we're going to find a place to mount that. I think what I'm going to do is I've got some adhesive Velcro. I'm going to cut a piece of that so that I have the option of removing the receiver if ever I want to change servos or something. I'm going to try and have this Velcroed in place so that I could maybe reach in, pop it out, and make new connections. I don't know if that's going to work, but I'm going to give it a shot. The other thing we're going to do is we've got to, once we make those connections, we've got to pair with the transmitter. And I'll probably do that in a different video, just because some of you might not be using the same transmitter and receiver that I am. Okay, so now we have the cables run from the servos and the electronic speed controller into the receiver. So when we're doing that, it's important that we keep track of the cable colors and which pins they're going to. So if you look at your receiver, you can see that there's a negative, a plus, and whatever that square wave symbol is. The negative is the black, the plus is the red, and the square wave symbol, the pulse width modulation symbol, is the white. So we make sure we have those all set up, and we'll hold off on hooking up lights. We'll try that in a bit. So I've got a battery here. A lot of my stuff is Traxxas, so I've got all these Traxxas batteries, and I've got a converter that goes from XT60 to Traxxas, and we're going to try hooking that up right now. All right, so we should be powered, and we will hold on to this in case it takes off. We'll power this guy on. Okay, well, powered on. Now we've got to go through the process of pairing our transmitter with our receiver. And like I said, I may not include that in this video. Look for another video that tells you how to do that for the MT12 from RadioMaster. Otherwise, follow the instructions for your receiver. Make sure that you have power. So the Hobbywing is powered by a battery, and then that should send voltage to the red and black wires. And then if you get those lined up properly and you power the receiver on and off 3 times. Whoa. Okay. Oh wait, there we go. All right, so you can see, you will notice that I have the tires blocked up with the suspension shocks. That's really important because every once in a while when you do something like this, it'll take off on you. And I've definitely had it fly across the workbench before. So I'm happy I had that blocked up, and you just saw why. Okay, so now that this is flashing, we will power on our radio.
Welcome to EdgeTX.
And we'll hit System. And then we'll hit, whoops, that was wrong. We will scroll to Express LRS, hit enter there. And then with this guy still in flashing mode, we'll hit bind. So binding, and it just bound. And now we have a solid light. So now we're bound and we can go through the setup process. Okay, so to do the setup, we're going to make sure that we have our motor on channel 2, our front steering servo on channel 1, our rear steering servo on channel 3. And while we're at it, maybe we'll see if this thing will power our lights. Yeah. What do you think of that? So maybe, yeah, for now we'll just keep those guys on channels 4 and 5. And later, if we're going to add a dig servo or something, we can use something like a Y splitter for the lights. But for now, we'll keep that extra cabling out of here. Okay, so we've got forward steering servo on channel 1, ESC on channel 2, rear steering servo on channel 3. And let's get into the menus and make sure we have everything set up properly. Okay, so our receiver is bound. You can see I was just experimenting, making sure that I could power the lights off of channels 4 and 5. So happy with that. And now we're going to make sure we have, this is front steering plugged into channel 1 and rear steering plugged into channel 3. Wedge this guy in here. Okay. Always nice when you see a little adjustment there. Now we're going to mess around with the receiver a little bit to make sure, sorry, just got us out to the home screen. So we're going to go, oops, go model. Make sure we're on the model selection that we want. Yes. And then we're going to scroll over to mixes, and let's make sure that we see what we want there. So channel 1, steering. That seems to be working. Channel 2 says throttle. So that seems to be driving us in reverse, so maybe we should fix that. All right, so let's press and hold, edit. So we can drive that into reverse. Let's see. Aha. So we drove that to -100. And now if I squeeze the throttle, it's going towards the front, which is this way. So that's great. So that was cool. We could do that. All right, so let's back up out of that. And let's see if we can set up the rear steer to be one of these potentiometers. So channel 3, edit that. And what you can do here is, even if you don't know what each switch or potentiometer is, you can go and you can select source. And then when you touch it, like I'm going to touch this potentiometer, it changed the source. So it just changed it to 6. I think I want it to be 5. Whoops. Oops, we don't want it to be a throttle. We want it to be 5. Okay. And it looks like there's an offset in here. They're not quite pointed straight. So this is where you can do some trimming. So, oh, too far. So it's doing slight little adjustments till we get that trim just right. Yeah, we'll screw around with this more when we get outside. But there, we just trimmed it a little bit. let's get back up to the next screen. And while we're here, let's just make sure we're happy with what everything's doing. Front steer. Oh, front steer seems to be reversed as well. Oops, sorry, I should have hit edit. Go down here. Let's give that a try. Nice. Okay, now we're going in the right direction. This guy, yeah, we may end up reversing that too. It kind of depends how you want it to work, but we'll screw around with that when we get it all put back together and outside. The most important thing here is all the channels seem to be hooked up. Radio seems to be bound. Let's screw everything back together. Okay, so at this point, we're not yet bolted back on, but we've made sure that all of our cables are tucked in and all of our cable management is looking okay. And boy, no, there's something I might want to fix here. So I can see that I've got a servo cable that's running down near the drive shaft. I'm going to fix that quick. Let's take a look at how we use this Hobbywing programming card in order to control the characteristics of our Hobbywing Fusion Pro brushless motor. So you can see I've started to pull out this little power button. I used Velcro to adhere the power button into the inside of the body of the Capra, and this has been great. I also did the same thing with the receiver, so you can kind of pull it off from the outside using, a pair of pliers carefully or your fingers. And then once you get this out, there's a little rubber plug that's plugging three contacts, and you make sure that you get, let me zoom this in here. You make sure that you can see the minus, positive, and square wave, and that corresponds to the black, red, and white. And then you carefully get those lined up and push it in. And then, zoom back out here. What you're gonna do, you're gonna power off.
Telemetry lost.
And then when you power back on, the card is powered by your electronic system. So when the Hobbywing Fusion Pro comes, it comes with a sticker, and you can choose to put this sticker onto your program card, and it tells you a bunch of the different operating characteristics that you're going to be interested in. So here's an idea of that. Most of these you can experiment with. I think the most important ones are the running mode. So the RPM matching is fantastic for rock crawling. And then the motor rotation, number 5, you might find that when you squeeze the throttle on your radio at first, that the motor's spinning the wrong direction. You can either fix that in a programmable radio if that's what you're working with, or you can fix it here. So basically what you're going to do, you're going to click through the item numbers, and you can see what values are currently set. And then if you wanted to change it, you would change the value and then hit OK, and it'll flash it onto the motor, or the ESC more accurately. So I'm going to set that back to 1. And then you can go through and let's check number 5. Says we're operating in clockwise is positive throttle. So this is pretty easy to experiment with. A lot of the cool, like the brake force and the brake onset rates and stuff like that, you can mess around and maybe get some fine tuning that helps you crawl. All right, and then once this is done, you can just turn everything off. I'm not sure whether you really have to turn it off, but I'm just going to turn this off to remove this.
Telemetry lost.
And then we're going to take this little plug and we're going to very carefully line up with the pins. And gently push that back in. And then we're just going to re-adhere that with the Velcro on the inside. And we're off. Okay, so let's talk about how we use the RadioMaster MT12 and the mixes function to do some of the neat stuff we're doing with opposite steer or proportional control over the rear steer or crab walk. So what we're going to do, we're going to go into model, we're going to select our Capra, go over a few pages until we get to mixes. This is where the magic happens. So in this mixes menu, you can use switches and you can change gains, you can set up logic, you can change curves. It's really, really neat. And the RadioMaster, or the programming language, the operating system, sorry, that runs on this radio makes it really, really intuitive once you understand a couple of concepts. So you can see here I've already changed the gain on my steering in order to be negative 100. For whatever reason, it was backwards when I first set it up. I also changed channel 2, which is the throttle, which is here, to be 60% gain. It's a rock crawler, so we like to go slow. And then channel 3, you can see there's a bunch of interesting business going on here. So cool thing, once you have this set up, if you change the position of this switch, so switch A, you can see that the bolded letters move as I move that switch. So this makes it really easy to understand, like, all right, what am I adjusting right now? So let's put the switch all the way out, and that's SA in the down position, I guess. And let's take a look at how that's set up. And just to help you understand how I got these 3 things here, you can do, if you press and hold this scroll button, you do insert after, and go back, you'll see that just added a line here. So I had 3 under channel 3, I just added 1, and let's just delete it. Okay, so now we're gonna edit this one here. So press and hold, edit, and you could give this a name if you wanted, but what I'm gonna show you is how to set up what is the source for this steering of the rear steer when the switch is in that outer position. And when it's in that outer position, what I wanna do is I want to control it with this potentiometer, but I'll show you that when that's flashing, if you touch another potentiometer or another switch, it automatically changes the source to, I guess that's called 06. What I want is this one here, so if I touch it while that's flashing, it'll change it to 05. And then you can mess around with the direction you want it to steer. If you wanted to reverse it, you could go and you could change, the weight from positive 100 to minus 100 or vice versa, or some proportion in between. And then once you have that set up, you can return to go up to mixes. So when it's in this position, I'm using this guy to control the rear steer. And then if I want to set it up so that when this switch is in the middle position, I want to use the steering, but I want that to be positive 100. And then when the switch is in this all the way in position, I want it to do the opposite direction for the rear steer. So I have that set up to minus 100. And again, you press and hold, you'd go into edit. And if you wanted to change the source, you'd go in and touch whatever you want to control that. And then you can go in, change the gain to whatever you wanted. Maybe you make that lower. You get a little bit more anemic performance from the rear, or whoops. Pump that back up. And now, that's back up to 100%. So once you get in and you start messing around with these mixes, it becomes relatively easy to understand. If you want to take a screenshot of what I'm showing here, this is how I have my truck set up. This is with stock servos in the standard position and the Hobbywing Fusion Pro installed. I think the one thing I changed in the Fusion Pro is the clockwise versus counterclockwise direction. That would change whether your throttle is a positive number or minus number, but a negative number. You can mess around with that. All right, have fun with this.